Greetings, everyone. My name is Ebony Horton, and I am so excited that you clicked on this session. I love learning more and telling more about how to tell a student story. I know in higher education and even in K 12, sometimes we hear some of the most amazing success stories, whether they're from survival or simply a student who is just excelling beyond anybody's imagination. But we don't really think to share that story with the media or even internally. We just kind of let it go in our ears and settle in our hearts and know that that particular student is going to make it big one day. Well, this session is designed to offer some practical, top of mind resources and tools that you can use so that you can better tell the student story and all the great things happening at your schools without the stress or without the afterthought of how much work it would actually take to do. Now, we'll offer this disclaimer. I know in higher education, we are responsible for telling success stories and all the other amazing things about our colleges in order to recruit more students there so that they know that they can reach similar success. In K 12, especially in the public aspect of it, you're not always tasked with having to recruit students. However, there is still amazing room left to be able to share this story so that you can just better highlight yourselves within your community and show the world what's happening right here in Alabama. So, we are about to get started, and I am going to share my screen. Alrighty here. Okay, so when you think of telling the student story, tell me some things or think about some things that you think of in this case. A lot of times, the first thing that comes to mind is the honor rolls and just the really cool recognitions that students get on Honors Day that might make it to the newspaper if someone snaps a picture. But if we go a little deeper, there are far more stories to tell. And as I said, we'll dig a little deeper into the whys of this, as well as the practical way to get it done. Let's take a look at these individuals. What do you think each of them has in common? I'm sure somebody's thinking, of course, they're all actors and actresses. They're obviously all very successful, probably have more money than all of us, huh? Well, one thing that each of them has in common is that each of them attended a community college. You know how we know that? Because we've seen news articles, particularly with Tom Hanks, where he shared his experiences and how the community college has been the foundation of everything that he did moving forward. He even mentioned some instructors who have stuck out and made a difference in his life. We wouldn't know this information had these students, these alumni now, or their educators share that they actually got their starts to thinking about success, making a difference in the world right at their community college. I can imagine how many students would be interested in going to that school or learning more about it as a result of that. Now I want you to look at these students and tell me if you, or I'm sorry, look at these individuals and tell me if there's anything that sticks out about any of them. Well, not only did these individuals attend a community college, each one of them attended a community college in Alabama. And they have been great representations of just the athletics, the business classes, several other factors, the humanity, the friendship, the student life that happens at our community colleges. We're especially thankful to each of them. The one that I've interviewed personally for a success story in recent months is Keith Richards, who attended Jeff State. If you've ever gone to a Taziki's restaurant, he is the one behind all of them. He owns those. Jimmy Westbrook, obviously, if you're familiar with Big Little Town, is one of our alums. Deontay Wilder, who was actually recognized by the Pope for how kind he is and the efforts that he's made. I'm not sure how kind he is as a boxer, but the efforts that he has made to assist humanity. He was a Shelton State alum. And then you have Jorge Postada, I believe, who retired from Major League. When you think of these individuals, and again, when you think of your local classrooms, what do you think makes a good story? Obviously, it could be that one of these students, particularly Mr. Keith Richards, who owns Taziki's, wasn't really sure what he wanted to do while he was at community college, but as soon as he left, was able to dig into the community and find out shortly later that his career or his goal was to actually share humanity and really cool things in addition to delicious food with the world. And you can read more about his story on our social media as well as Taziki's website. I think more about my children in K 12 and just the stories that they've come home to tell me about students who maybe had a hard life at some point but rose to the top of their class. A lot of times, the easier grabs, I guess, are like the ones we talked about earlier, where a picture might have been snapped at an honor ceremony or a student makes an honor roll. But all of these things, even though they make a good story, can turn into something bigger than just a good story in our head. Here's a take on what some of our good stories started off as.
Life doesn't wait for you. Ended up having a child and a family of my own, and by then, I still just had a high school education.
I was always scared of transitioning from high school to college.
I never knew exactly what I wanted to do when I was in high school.
I spent 21 and a half years in the military, and there's not a lot of call for that kind of work, reconnaissance and security in the civilian world. So I was struggling to find a job.
People want experience. You can't get experience while going to college.
I wasn't fully satisfied with my career.
I really thought I was too old to go to school.
All right, so that's just a little bit about their stories, but we'll hear a little more here on to see the middle part of that story. And I'll again talk more about that too. But that's how some good stories started. Just everyday folks telling you a little bit about their lives. Now, here's an overview of what we'll talk about throughout this session. We've already covered a little bit of what a good story is, but we'll also talk about what stories to tell that really stick out and really show a difference between your school, what sets you apart, and other folks in K 12 education. We'll talk about where to tell these stories. Maybe not every story is worth reaching out to your local newspaper, but there is somewhere for it to go. We'll talk a little bit about goals to kind of reel in when to know how to make a bigger story or a bigger deal out of something that you're told, and when to maybe just put it in a newsletter or some other resource to get the story told and make that student feel special. But isn't, I guess, as big of a spread as another one would be. We'll talk about the grand execution, how to make these stories happen, as well as branding and consistency. And then I'll give you my top tools and my takeaways. All right, so we talked about what makes a good story. Let's talk about what's in a good story. Obviously, it has to be a truthful story, right? And some of you may have seen, I believe it printed on Fox News, maybe not even a couple months ago, of a homecoming queen who fabricated the story, and her mother, who worked at the school, actually helped her fabricate the numbers. Very, very sad story. And I'm sure the bigger story, which wasn't a good story, was that she had fabricated those numbers versus the fact that she actually won the homecoming queen designation. So you want to make sure that your student is telling the truth and that you're representing the truth that's in that story. Another thing that makes a good story is the emotion, right? How many of us watch the quote unquote stories, as they called it back in the day? Do those even come on anymore? Well, a lot of things that drew us in and a lot of things that continue to draw us into series on Netflix or Hulu is the fact that they invoke some kind of emotion. They get us happy, they might get us sad, but they give us just an opportunity to experience sympathy and empathy. Another thing that makes a good story is a call to action somewhere within that story. Now, this could be about donations for a local organization. It could be about how to reach out to a student and contribute to their education in the future. If this is maybe a high school senior who struggled, unfortunately, we've had a lot of tornadoes and things throughout Alabama. I saw a lot of stories follow up on how schools have reached out to offer these students scholarships or offer them special accommodations at their particular colleges. Um, and open the door for the community to help too. So that's where I get the call to action. It has a beginning, middle, and end. Like I said, I showed you guys the beginning of a story that we'll kind of map out throughout this session. I'll show you two more pieces of it. And then it also has opportunities. So just like the students, the alumni who are successful now that I showed you at the beginning of this presentation, seeing their story might show another student that they can have those same opportunities. And even though each of those students' success isn't attributed just to the community college, knowing that we were a part of their story really makes us smile and potentially motivates another student to let them know that they can take a similar path. One thing that's very important, in addition to telling the student story, though, is that when you tell your own story, you get to control the narrative and create your identity. Let's face it, in our communities, many around the state, there are enough bad things that happen, right? A student is abused, unfortunately, or something has happened, a building might have collapsed, or food poisoning in the lunchroom. We have those stories that circulate that are going to be reported and are going to happen. And we just, I mean, that's life. So to be able to flood your local communities with the positive things that are happening there tends to balance out that particular story and actually show that your school is amazing, because it is, because of all the educators, all the students there who are really committed to success and wanting the best for each other. You want to be able to get that story and that point across. And that is exactly why we do what we do, to tell that student story, to get that perspective within the hearts and minds of our community in case we need something like a meal increase, for example, or donation for a particular building or program or activity in our classrooms. We want to get those stories out so that folks know that what we're doing is a big deal. This is an example of just some quick social media posts that I made a couple years back for our All Alabama academic team. And we say that those are the best of the best and brightest of our schools. But if you listen to it, you hear, not if you listen to it, if you read these little caveats, you'll see just how special these students thought that their colleges were. And here we are recognizing them because we're so honored they chose us. But the experiences that they were able to have at our colleges really stuck out to them. And so why not pull one of them aside and grab a quote like I did at that meeting? This is something very easy to do, and it speaks volumes, represents them well as you as a higher or as a K-12 educator. Now, let's talk a little bit about what story to tell. You all have tons of stories going on in your schools, right? That are just absolutely amazing. Here are some of the stories that we've told, and I'm sure that in each of these stories, you have a student that you might have had who attended your high school or attended your middle school or elementary school that you could have featured well before we got to them. But we took that opportunity. Here you'll see Mayor Timothy Ragland of Talladega. At the time he was elected, he was the youngest mayor in the state of Alabama. He attended Marion Military Institute, which is a prestigious and very unique military school right here in Alabama, and also a community college. And so being able to catch up with him and tell his story via video about what the community college meant to him was a really big story. We featured that on our social media, our YouTube, and I believe it also made it probably in a couple publications because him being elected was such a big deal. This middle flyer right here that talks about Alabama Fame, that is one of our premier apprenticeship programs. And it was one of those things that obviously we had to make some aspects of it virtual, or the advertising of it virtual during the pandemic. But being able to tell the story of students who weren't sure whether they were going to make it or not, Lexi, I think about, who was a foster child who was determined to get a 4-year degree and attended a 4-year university, but realized the pace just wasn't for her. She ended up at one of our community colleges and was actually able to meet Ivanka Trump when Ivanka came down to promote manufacturing in Alabama a couple years ago. So being able to promote these events and share stories like Lexi's are a really big deal for us. Over here to the right is some of our students, but more of a generic story just about graduation. I get so amazed at the stories that come out about high school graduations where an instructor has had to take his shoes off, for instance, and provide them to a student, or just recently a story I'll talk about a little later about the Waffle House grad in Birmingham who wasn't going to go to graduation, but his manager made sure that he had everything that he needed and held some special things for him right there at the restaurant. At the bottom here are just the more generic stories that are worth telling. There might be a unique program or new equipment that you have at your school that you want to tell the community about. Maybe you received a grant for it, or maybe it's something that is part of your career center that's also available to the community. Those kinds of stories really, really make waves. We have Community College Month here in April, but I'm sure there's some uh, annual months and programs that run simultaneously with the K-12 schedule. So finding those months and really just taking advantage of them, or even the days like Administrators Day or President's Day, or Teacher Appreciation Week, featuring those things on social media, highlighting a teacher, highlighting an administrator. All these things are those feel good opportunities that get the word out about how excellent you're doing at your school. Also promoting things that are unique to you. During the pandemic, we wanted to make it known in higher ed that all of our community colleges are open admissions, meaning students didn't have to take an ACT to get through our doors. It was a huge game changer for us because at the time there was just so much craziness on where to take an ACT or what schools were waiving and what were not. So we just wanted to get it out there that, hey, that's not a big deal with our schools. So looking for opportunities like that in your communities is a big deal. And then featuring things that are timely, just like the open admissions policy, where you're recognizing folks for the things that they do. We did a spread on healthcare heroes and just thanking them during the pandemic for the differences that they made. And so now that I've told you what stories to tell, I want to tell you another piece of the story that we started where we just had basic general students be able to show what made their story make sense.
It's definitely been able to give me a head start on what college life is going to be like.
Going into college, it was like crazy because I was already ahead because of the dual enrollment. I didn't have to take certain classes.
You don't have these massive classes. It's more individualized, I think. I feel like you connect with your instructors more.
From the very first day, I had every instructor their personal phone number. They were very interested in making sure that we understood what we were doing.
Truly, if I had not gone to Enterprise State Community College and the resources there were not available, I don't know if I would have gone to college right off the bat. I certainly wouldn't be 2 years debt-free.
We were able to create a schedule that allowed me to still get my hours at work while attending the class.
It was like a jump started. It just put me right back to where I was with my peers again.
All right, it gets better, doesn't it? They talk about just what the community college did, and we'll happen to end to that, I promise, later in the session. All right, so we've talked about what's in a good story, and let's talk about where to tell these good stories. Now, obviously, we think when we're thinking of a cool story that you go straight to media, right? Well, that is one stop, going to radio and print, but there's several other ways that you can talk about your students. Think about your community or student events. If you have something like an LMS like Canvas or Blackboard, where you can post a video up every now and again, or you can just do little blurbs where students tell their stories to each other, that's an excellent idea. Campus visits, even though you are public and even though your students are pretty much your students, you can still make cool little caveats or cool little pieces of stories and have them running on the screens throughout the school or in Google Chrome in your classroom. A few students talking about why they enjoy your class and what they hope that the newest class can bring in. Social media obviously is one of our easiest touches, and we'll go into detail about that, where you can use a program like Canva or even go a little deeper into Adobe and just get some quick little snapshot videos or um, images, graphics to tell a student's story or just feature their picture and then write out the rest of their story. And then your internal media, your website is always an easy grab. Your parent apps, whether that's Dojo or a Mind or some of the other ones out there. We talked about Google Classroom, letters, stakeholder touch points like your chambers, so many ways and so many places that you can get student stories out and be able to tell their story. Let's talk a little bit about the goals of telling this or the why sometimes of telling a student story. You want to accurately illustrate why it's being told in the first place. And here on the left, we have one of our students, another Marion Military Institute student, who's actually competed in the Olympics. She went on to the Coast Guard to serve and had the opportunity to compete in the Olympics. So Alabama's community colleges have an Olympian who walked through our doors. We're so excited. Um, Another goal when telling this story is to determine how and where you want to promote the story. Again, our first thought is always media. But as I showed you in that previous slide, there's so many other places that you can tell that story. Goals also include keeping your audience in mind. Sometimes those stories are meant for student to student access. So you have one student telling a story to hopefully motivate others. But a lot of times, especially in higher ed, we have other stakeholders like our local legislators who help fund us, right? We want to be able to share with them that what they're investing in is definitely worth their while. Another goal is to determine the consistency of similar stories. So you don't want to tell a one student story at the beginning of the year and then not tell another one until graduation. I know that this might not be a huge priority if you're not already a media specialist or someone within your school who helps with the social media and the marketing. So if it's once every quarter, that's great. If it is just twice a year, that's great. I encourage more. But whatever it is, it just needs to be consistent. So we've talked about goals. Let's talk about the factors in executing these stories. And if this is a live session, this will be about where we start with some questions before we move into the actual execution. But we will keep on. And like I said, I'll provide my email and phone number at the end. So who's going to see these stories? We talked a little bit about legislators, whether it's other students, whether it's your workforce or just a general feel-good community story. That ties in into how you'll actually tell the story. Determining who needs to be featured is a big deal because you don't want to give a 1 hour instructional video to first graders, right? So when you look at who needs to be featured, if that was something that you had to do, you want to think of some fun, engaging things to incorporate, some fun and engaging individuals to incorporate, so that the audience that you have will definitely benefit from what they see. And then finally, you want to know what needs to be asked or said. In journalism, I'm a former news reporter. There was always a who, what, where, when, why, and how. The H actually got added on later on in life. Um, but you want to make sure that you fit all those pieces of the story into the particular story. We'll talk a little bit here about releases and waivers. I know with FERPA, we have a lot of things that we kind of shove the students at the beginning of the school year to get them to sign and give permission for us to be able to use their likeness in any of our media. But sometimes you might want to go a bit deeper depending on how big the story is. And then branding and consistency to make that story awesome. The first thing, again, we want to highlight is that sometimes when you're telling these stories based on the audience, that can also guide how well the story is told. And so, when you think of generational tendencies, which change all the time, here are just some snapshots of what to consider when you're shooting a video or using a graphic. Gen X and millennials tend to like tutorials. For example, I know FAFSA is becoming a bigger part of your schedules in the coming years, and we won't debate that here. I know there's some discussion on both sides of that. But in order to get these students to complete that FAFSA successfully, it might be an opportunity to do some videos where you talk about students who did benefit from the FAFSA and then offer instructions on how to get that done. Learning about registration, a lot of registration processes have gone digital. I know we're digital in Elmore County, and I just could not figure out how to get that done until watching a video and realizing that the only way to register my students or my children was to actually have the code from the previous year's report card. So that gets fun, I'm sure, for administrators and administrative staff right before school year starts, because we should have registered them in the summertime. Gen Z tends to like those really cool, quick videos. 8 seconds about a year ago was the magic number, and I wouldn't doubt that that's dropped down to maybe even 2 or 3. You got to snap their attention in order to be able to get them excited. And I asked what's in the lead. That's just a journalism term that talks about what's in the beginning of a story. Varied groups like explainer videos, like we talked about. But the main thing to remember is that internal generational standards, to better inform stakeholders or convince them, is a huge piece that you need to consider when you're talking about that forward facing story, whether it's about a student or whether it's about something that's happening in your school. So these generational gaps or the information per generation is very interesting. We'd like to think that every cool story pulls the appropriate heartstrings, but we're different individuals. So we have to clump up the stories we tell based on who that major audience is that we want to tell that story to. Moving right along, I said I'd talk about video releases. I know this is small print, but this is just an example from the Florida State College at Jacksonville of a video release that they made available. And again, we have FERPA, we have the little blurb or the page that we should have on file for most students that says whether or not they can be recorded. But this one just takes it a little bit deeper, where you're releasing the school from any liability if we choose to maybe chop the story up and put it in a bunch of different videos, or if maybe, which we want to be extra careful that, or pretty much guide how a story is going to be received, but maybe there is a negative response that we've accidentally kept the comments on in a YouTube page. We want to make sure that that particular student and their family isn't holding us responsible for a good and noble deed. And so you might want to consider Googling a video release just to make sure that you're covered if you're shooting video and featuring that student story. Let's move on a little bit to the branding and the consistency. Now, I know it's easy on social media just to throw up a picture or to throw up a cute little flyer that a teacher has made that had the old logo from 10 years ago on it. Well, when you think about the professionalism of your organization, no matter what school you're at, what grade you're teaching, you want to make those things consistent with everything else that's being shared at that school. And I mean all the way from the fonts that you use in your flyers to the size, the logo, the flyers that you make. You want to stay consistent with those things because, again, you never know who's just walking by your page to see something, and then they see so much inconsistency that they might miss a really cool story that's on your social media or on your YouTube page or even in your newsletter. Might not want to pick it up because there's just so many fonts and it's so busy. So you want to make sure that as excellent as the information is and as much time as you take to get content out to your local community and the news stations, that those things have a consistency about them, that gives your brand a good reputation or your school a good reputation. One example of this is theming some things. We have a series that's pending because I've been busy, but I plan on introducing How You Learning. And basically, I just go to any of our colleges and just randomly select students to find out how they're learning, whether it's virtually, whether they're going to study halls, whether they're in class, just some neat little features to illustrate the student life that we have on our campuses. And then access granted, we recently actually won an award for during the pandemic because we weren't really able to do a lot of things on campus. We at the system office in Montgomery would go through our college's social media pages and talk to their presidents and find out what was happening. And we actually put on a production, kind of a news story in essence, that featured each week the cool things that were happening at our schools. And that way, the community was still being able to have access to services. And it was awesome. We had food banks, we had nursing students, a lot of things to feature during that time. We were very thankful. Again, another piece of that branding and consistency is a toolkit, which is part of the title of this presentation. um, when it comes to consistency, a lot of times some of your best teachers, again, really don't have time just to dig down and tell a story. So why not offer them some easy resources and some easy grabs to be able to do that throughout their classrooms and get it to the community? We use Dropbox, Google Drive, SharePoint, any of these that you can think of, Evernote, just to get some consistent and give everybody access, obviously, some consistency. Each of these flyers, as you can see, can actually be filled and replaced. Logos can be replaced. Anything within the local community to make it work for them. So if you're a district of 20 schools or 30 schools, being able to have a toolkit somewhere where you can easily access it for consistency's sake, even if it's a video template where you just kind of upload things in it, that'll be beneficial to you. Also remember that even though you kind of want to have a general focus or goal on where you want a story to be, that story can go anywhere and you can cross post it anywhere. Here's an example of how Elmore County Child Nutrition during the pandemic and even now was able to get their information out about their local food programs when parents were able to pull up or a bus went around to provide meals during the previous summer. They put those things out on Facebook for easy access. Well, look what happened. AL.com actually picked that story up, and I want to say did multiple stories on just how excellent that program was, from the volunteers that they had, all the way to just how well they did putting it together and providing lines so that parents could be able to feed their kids. It was an amazing thing. And all of it started because somebody knew about it, right? Through social media. And I always say, because I'm a former newspaper reporter, I worked at the Dothan Eagle in Dothan for years, do not forget about print. So we talk a lot about getting these things on social media and a lot about getting these things out through video or newsletters and things like that internally. But don't forget when you're calling your TV station to also reach out to your local newspaper. Believe it or not, that sums up what I have in this session about execution. Now, we could go on and on about how to use certain things to be able to tell the story, and we will do a little bit about that later. But that was the gist of the why of why we tell our student stories. And now we're going to get into some of the tools that we can use to do that. First off, let's start with design. If you've not heard of Canva or used Canva, you are missing out. Canva is an excellent resource, even the free version. I think the paid version is about $9 a month, but even the free version helps you get some easy flyers going, even video now, even presentations. These slides, many were made just using Canva images and plugging them in. So Canva is a resource that you can use to make those designs. And then obviously the Adobe Suite, some of those are cloud-based, and I think they're things like Adobe Spark with some free designs in it that you can use just to be able to tell that student story. For videos and photo, obviously there's some amazing cameras out there, but I highly recommend, just for the consistency and convenience, just having a decent cell phone with a camera and shooting those quick videos on Instagram. You can only do about 60 seconds in a stream anyway. So maybe 50 seconds streaming an activity that's happening in your classroom and getting that on social media, or sending it to your local news stations and newspapers, just as kind of a preview of a cool activity that's happening on your campus. Adobe Premiere Elements is also a good resource to edit video if you want to go a little deeper. They do have Adobe Premiere Pro, which is a heavier program, but that Elements is a quick grab that I actually used in my newspaper days. Now, for organization and time management, I love Toggle Track. Toggle Track, there's also a free version of it, allows you to keep track of the things that you're doing throughout the day, so that you'll know how much time you're committing to it. And so, if you are really serious about being able to tell a student story, you can turn that Toggle Track timer on every time you sit down and start working on one, so that you can just gauge how much time you're actually spending on that effort. And then look at the results of it. Look at the feedback that you're getting in the community. Look at the comments that you might be getting on social media, just to make sure that the time you're investing is really working. And if it isn't, invest more time maybe, or look at something different to get that point across. And if it is, you're doing well. Another thing for organization is Hootsuite, the little owl there. You can post there essentially to as many sites, I think up to 5 sites, but for free, you can post up to 3. For free, you can post up to 3. That rhymes. Simultaneously. And so that way you're not having to upload a video to 3 different sites, or upload an image to 3 different sites and having to visit it and take up time. You can do all of that through Hootsuite, and that's HOOTSUITE. A lot of times you want to add that E in between the the two. Another one that you can do that with Facebook and Instagram is Facebook Business. And that's a really good one to use when you just have a quick video or image that you want to share. Then you also have Dropbox, which is a good resource. There's a free version up to a certain amount of time, where you can kind of put those toolkits, or up to a certain amount of storage, I'm sorry, where you can kind of put those toolkits in there. Google Drive, and then that good old fashioned flash drive, where you can keep your files organized and managed. As far as contacts, I love Microsoft Office Suite, whether I'm putting something in a spreadsheet or even a Microsoft Word document, or maybe you have some really cool success stories you want to tell, but you can't get to all of them right then, or you want to call a parent just to run some things by them. Make a list of those contacts so you can follow up. And then you can also use Google. I love Google Sheets, Google Forms, so many awesome Google things that are available to us moving forward. And then you also have story resources that can really help you. EAB is a good higher ed source that we use, but they also have some neat information about high school trends. They just recently released one about what high school students look for when they're thinking about going to college. And one of the things they featured is just how often students use social media. So that's definitely one that you can consider. There's some little pictures of students down there where they're our best resource. We want to know from them what's cool. And I know a lot of times outside of the Title I surveys, there aren't too many surveys that go around for our students in K-12, but it might be worth asking them a few questions about things that stick out and doing a funny video of their answers, like a trivia or something. A calendar, your community calendar, as well as any other calendar that you set, is a good resource when it comes to trying to find out what's happening and how you can connect a cool story to that. And then obviously social media groups, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. And then your local chambers of commerce, seeing what they have going on, seeing what new businesses are there, so that you can send them maybe a welcome letter, or welcome video or email with some highlights from student stories or student successes within your school walls. That will be really, really good. And then this black and white building was just to let you know that you can reach out to your colleges too and see what things they like to know in order to grant scholarships outside of academics. And think aim to satisfy more of those students. Now that we have gone over our tools, I want to give you guys some takeaways. Obviously, you want to work smarter and harder if you haven't already been telling these student stories. If you have, then you want to work smarter and not harder. It's very important, we know, to tell our student stories. Look, that story I told y'all about of the Birmingham student who's coming to Lawson State made it all the way to the Washington Post. When he was about to skip his graduation, and his manager just said no. How many students do you think that something like that would impact, knowing that there are people out there who care for them and want the best? Our college actually reached out to this particular student and offered him a scholarship to come there because he probably, I don't know, but I don't think that he was planning on going to college. And so to have his story broadcast and to pique the interest of one of our presidents to actually give him that opportunity was pretty phenomenal. Same thing happened in Wallace State, where a student or a child unfortunately lost both of his parents in a tornado. Well, that child, I think, is less than 13 years old. I want to say younger, but he already has a full ride to one of our community colleges if he chooses it. So just being able to tell these stories lets folks know that we're here, but it also lets you know just the love and the beauty of humanity, the best parts of it. The one below on the Today Show, that's not a local story, but it is a story about students who went back and started taking pictures in fields. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of really neat and unique photos on social media now because people are paying homage to where they came from. And so seeing these stories and sharing these stories, whether it's the student who shared it or their families who shared it, are a big deal. And then the one at the bottom, the stories that we share could be the academic story where you have 3 students who score perfectly on their ACT. We want to tell the world about that, right? Number 2 of my takeaways, you want to aim when you're telling your bigger stories to have at least 3 touch points in those stories. And whether that's the newspaper, newsletter, TV station, JoJo, Remind, radio, church, getting on the program to be able to tell stories, whether it's about a student getting a scholarship or a event happening at the career center to help your students find jobs once they hit 16. Any resource that you can get that story out to, aim to try to do that at least 3 times per story. And then it builds something within you to let you know that those stories are worthwhile. But it also gets exposure out to those students. Another one is you want to get the students involved in advertisements. And this is especially when it comes to social media. If you highlight a student, whether it's an award or a scholarship they received, get them to share that story. This one, I believe, had tons more likes before I actually posted it on here. But there was likely someone who told his story and he just shared it, whether it was a college, whether it was somebody within his community. And getting 228 likes is a pretty big deal, even when you're a smaller community or a smaller school. But imagine that's more than 200 people who looked at a story that they probably had no idea existed until that story was told. So make sure the students know when you're posting the story or where, so that they can get that acclaim too. Another one of my takeaways is to make sure you represent yourself well. Again, talking about those toolkits and any other resources that you can think of so that everybody in your institution or your school has access to it. It keeps you consistent and it keeps your brand well protected. We pay a lot of money to, to do those logos. So we want to make sure that that information is consistent. And then you also, again, want to connect with organizations or groups, even social media groups that can keep you posted on the latest trends. Even on social media, Fitness for Teachers was a good one because there are a lot of teachers there who are talking about their fitness journeys, but they're also talking about students and the differences that they're being able to make. And students, even though we're talking about telling student stories, we can tell all kinds of stories, faculty and staff stories, joining community watch groups, the Public Relations Council of Alabama, which is a group that I'm a part of. If you do anything media-wise at your local schools, joining professional organizations like this can really help you enhance your brand. With all of this said, I want to tell y'all the last part of the story that we started at the very beginning.
I graduated March the 5th, March the 7th, I was on the job.
One of the friends that I met in the class, we went to a job fair in Tuscaloosa, and we both came away with jobs.
I got an internship here at APR, which eventually led to getting hired on.
I don't have to go work at a job that I can't stand anymore. You know, just to pay the bills. Now I can go do something that I enjoy doing and still make a better living than what I was doing.
Before I graduated, I had interviewed with 4 different hospitals. I had job offers from 3 of the 4, and the 4th one called me back after I accepted the position here.
I mean, being 21, I have a paid off 2017 Mustang. That's probably not a lot to other people, but to me, that's, we got my own car now.
I hold down a mortgage and I'm just 22.
You're gaining the work experience that employers are looking for on top of furthering your education and getting the degree that you seek.
I owe my career and the start of my career to Enterprise State Community College because they laid those initial building blocks and that foundation for me.
But it's not about being a degree mill. It's literally about setting you up for success, and if they can, getting you that employment that we all really want.
Those stories still warm my heart, and each one of those stories again is about one of our students that an instructor identified and said, hey, listen, this person has a story that needs to be told. I'm sure you have those same experiences within your walls, and I hope that I provided some information that encourages you to tell those stories even more. I'll leave this slide up for a second. I know that we're not in person, but if you do have any questions for me, or if you'd like to learn more about how we tell student stories at the Alabama Community College System, please feel free to reach out and connect. I want to thank you again so much for your time, and I wish you all the best success in telling your student stories.